the con immigration arguments for like closed and restricted borders, there's an analogy. And it's an interesting one that does come up. It's certainly worth knowing about. And it kind of is precipitated on this notion of property and ownership and your home. And it's never immoral to say no when it comes to your home. So let's see how the analogy goes. It's like, imagine that you're home and someone knocks on your door. You ask what the person wants, and they answer by requesting or demanding entry into your home. You say, I want to come in. You say no and close the door. Did you do anything immoral? Say you don't know this person. You don't know who they are. They come up to your door and say, I want in. And you say, no, you can't come in. Did you do anything immoral? The next, now suppose that person attempts to break into your home, like they try to force illegally enter your home. If you prevent that person from doing so by reinforcing the doors and windows, building a big wall or a moat around your house, maybe firing some warning shots in the air, or you call and have the law enforcers come and carry them off your property, did you do anything wrong? Morally? Did you act immorally? Now suppose that person, if they're sick, they're poor, they're whatever, and they come to your door and they request entry. They say that they're poor, they're sick, whatever, and they want entry in your house. That it would alleviate some of these problems for them. Suppose you say no. Did you do anything immoral? If you say, if you don't think you've done anything immoral across those three scenarios, then the way this is supposed to go, if it's not immoral to say no in those three types of scenarios, well, those are supposed to be very analogous to the situation faced at the U.S. borders when someone from another nation asks for entry or they illegally enter. If it's not wrong to do all those, to say no in all those cases when it's your home, your physical house, your residence, then why would it be wrong to say no when it's your physical nation, your country? It's your home too. So the idea is the U.S. can become, the analogy is between your personal property, your house that you bought, that you lived in, maybe generations of your family have lived in that house. If it's not wrong for you to tell a person no when they show up at your door in all three of those situations, it's not immoral to do so, at least. Then just insert, for home, insert the United States as your home. Then it shouldn't be immoral if you say no in all those same situations if it's someone from a different nation. That's the way it works. Thus, if that analogy works, remember an analogy has to take care of all the relevant details, morally relevant details. I'm not saying this analogy does. You need to think about that on your own. But if it is analogous, if your personal house is analogous to the United States as a nation, all the states, if it's morally relevantly similar, then it could very well be that the U.S. and its citizens are not morally obligated to help another nation's adults and children by allowing them into the U.S. Interesting. That analogy does go out there a whole lot. If it's not wrong to tell people no when they want to come into your house, for whatever reason you happen to have, notice it doesn't give an explanation for your reasons. It's just that if it's not wrong in principle to tell people no at your front door, then why in the world should it be wrong to tell people no at the border of your nation? In your physical house as well as the United States, don't both of those things count as your home? That's what the analogy assumes anyway. Another con immigration argument is it's not responsible for other people's bad luck. Sure, people have bad luck. That's reality. If you buy into that there's this notion of luck that's out there, some people seem to have a whole lot of bad luck. They'd have no luck at all if it wasn't for bad luck. I've heard people say that before. Well, that's just a recognition of a reality in our world and life as humans and on the planet we live. Sometimes there's some unlucky people. Well, in reality, though, there's a lot of people that have bad luck inside the United States. There is international bad luck. Like there's national poverty. We have national health problems. We have national persecution issues. We have national issues of people that have some really bad luck even though they're here. And, well, doesn't it seem morally best for the U.S. to take care of its own citizens' bad luck first before opening up the resources and the time that it's going to take? It always takes resources and time to try to correct someone's life that's had a bad go of it. That fixing bad luck or the consequences of seemingly bad luck can be really time consuming. It can be really expensive. An example would be, say a person, they have a child and that child has various, physical limitations or disabilities, or they have various mental issues. That there are federally funded and state funded programs to try to alleviate some of that responsibility off of your average U.S. parent. And so it's taking taxpayer time, it's taking money, it's taking medical time, it's taking social service time, and time is money. All of these people have to get paid. And it's taking those resources that could have gone to that U.S. citizen, the little one, the U.S. child that's born with these issues, which is really bad luck. If a person buys into luck, it's not ideal luck, at least. And so we have people in this country that have bad luck. And so why in the world would we be responsible for other people like non-U.S. citizen bad luck when we're doing all we can just to deal with the bad luck of our own? Well, if that sounds persuasive to you, then that should support the idea that U.S. citizens are not morally obligated to help another nation's adults and children, not at least until after we've dealt with all the bad luck in our own nation. Maybe. Does that work? It's an interesting argument to think about. Then there's a sort of sovereignty, right to control. It shows up a lot in the contra U.S. immigration stuff or a defense of immigration policies. This argument does various forms of it. I'm not saying this is the only form you'll ever see. It manifests in a lot of different ways. But one way to articulate it is to say that legitimate nations, they just have a right, like corporations have rights. Nations have rights too. And so the nation has a right to control the entry and settlement of non-citizens in their territories, as well as the terms and conditions for acquiring citizenship. There's quite a few ethicists that try to support this claim. And, well, it's never immoral for a legitimate nation to exercise any rights that it may have. Yeah, okay, so the U.S. is a legitimate nation, so that means it would follow that it has this right to control who comes in and is allowed to stay in this country or become a citizen. Well, then it would seem that the U.S. and its citizens, as long as this right's being exercised, it's not immoral to exercise it, and that sometimes includes turning potential immigrants away at the borders, then no, U.S. citizens are not morally obligated to help another nation's adults. Yep. Now, what we get into, these are the three like big contra-immigration arguments. There's a lot of detail in them. I'm not going to read through all this detail. I'll give you the highlights of them. I'm doing this talking over these arguments so you get a feel for them before you actually try to grind your way through all these words. So you have just kind of an overview of them. But there's at least three forms of arguments that try to defend this right to exclude. That this is like a right that the citizens of any nation or nation itself has, supposedly. It's not a human, it could be a human right. It could fall under that. But typically it's more thought of as a membership right. Like just from the sheer fact of being a member of something, you have some forms of right to exclude others from being a member of that thing. Or at least from a right to withhold the benefits that come from being a member from other people. Well, there's different ways people try, philosophical or ethicists, moralists, politicians, lawyers have tried to argue and defend this notion of some right to exclude. The first way tends to be this self-determination. And all of these rights to exclude imply some form of self-determination. But this first one does self-determination and freedom of association. It ties the two together. So what does that mean? Well, we'll just read through some of this. U.S. citizens possess a fairly robust right to self-determination. And what does that mean? That means they have a right to make choices that seem best for themselves and their families within the parameters of the U.S. laws. They have this right to self-determine, meaning to be the authors of their own lives. In fact, possessing this robust right to self-determination is one of the core aspects to even being a person, U.S. or otherwise, a citizen or otherwise. In a country like ours that's founded heavily on this notion of individualism, that the individual matters a whole lot, well, part of that is this notion that the individual matters a whole lot because they have a mind of their own. They have their own hopes, their own dreams, their own ambitions, their own ways they would like to help their family progress in this world, in this nation. And it's a right to do those things. Like that notion of the pursuit of happiness. Well, this would be a version of this right to pursue your happiness in how you see fit, to try to determine that, as long as it's within the legal parameters of the nation, that is. Well, so central to possessing this right to self-determination, what gives you ability to self-determine is, in order to do that, you have to have the freedom to associate yourself or your family with others as you see fit, and to likewise disassociate yourself from others as you see fit, or your family. So an example of this would be, would a person really be self-determining if the government came in and said, okay, you have to be friends with these 5 neighbors, and you have to be friends with them? You can't not be friends with them. You have to go to their house. You have to go to their cookouts. You have to go to whatever church of their choosing, or whatever, synagogue or mosque, whatever of their choosing. You have to actually buy into a lot of their values and beliefs. Would you think you were very self-determining if that's what you were forced to do? Not really. I mean, I have a suspicion that many people are going to say, yeah, I'm not really being much of the author of my own life if the government came in and told me I have to associate with certain people that I may share nothing in common with them. Even especially if it was antithetical to one's religious beliefs or one's spiritual beliefs or even maybe one's political beliefs. Would you really be self-determining if you were forced to associate with people that are just completely antithetical to your entire belief system? Well, assuming that U.S. citizens do possess this right to self-determination, and assuming that it has to include this freedom to associate or disassociate with other people, there's another example about being forced to live with people that are not of your choosing, or being forced to marry who you don't choose. That things like that would seem to say, yeah, that's kind of hindering self-determination. And so if U.S. citizens do have this right to self-determination, and it includes this freedom to associate or disassociate with others as one sees fit, then the U.S., well, it's just a collective of individuals. And so it inherits this large scale right to self-determination and freedom to associate or disassociate with whoever it wants to and chooses to. Well, if that means that at times the U.S. doesn't want to associate with people from a certain nation, it could be Mexico, it could be Canada, it could be Chile, it could be China, whoever. If the U.S. government and the citizens as a majority decide, yeah, we don't want to associate with people from that nation, so we don't let their immigrants in. Well, it would seem to be nothing morally problematic at all if it's always morally okay to exercise a right you have. And if it is true that individual U.S. citizens and the individual, or in the U.S. as an individual nation, has that right to self-determination and freedom of association or disassociation, then it would seem there's nothing morally obligatory at all when people show up at the gates. If you say, no, we don't want to associate with you, you're just exercising your right to self-determination and freedom of disassociation. Totally morally okay. That is the right to exclude two. You see how that implies that that's the right to exclude one. You see how that implies sort of right to exclude, a right to say, yeah, we exclude you from here. Why? Because we have this right to self-determination, and it's based on freedom of association and disassociation, and we don't want to associate with you. We're just exercising our freedom not to have to, and it's perfectly morally okay to do that. Then it would be morally okay to turn them away. There's no obligation to help. That's the way the argument tends to go. Do you buy it? It's interesting. It's worth thinking about. It's just as much worth thinking about it as those that are pro-immigration. Another one is collective ownership. This is like right to exclude too. That through the years and generations of hard work, labor, toil, investment, paying taxes, building roads and bridges and education systems, and every U.S. citizen, whatever our little job is contributing to the construction, the maintenance, the defense of all these U.S. socio-political, legal, medical, educational institutions and infrastructure, the markets. Every time you buy or sell something in this country, every time you go to school, you go to a hospital, you're enhancing the cultural and national achievements of this nation. And that means, given that you're mixing your labor with it, we all have partial ownership of that. That it's like we own these institutions as citizens of the United States. They're ours. We have a property claim or an ownership claim on them. Well, if you buy into that, then if every U.S. citizen does have some robust claim of at least partial ownership of everything that happens to be in this nation at any given time, its achievements, its knowledge, its educational resources, medical resources, bridges, railroads, planes, everything. If we all have partial ownership by our participation as citizens in this nation, well, then that means if you own something, especially in a country like this one, well, don't you have some entitlements to say what can and cannot be done with your property? Who can or cannot access or use your property? It's your property. You get to say what happens with it in many ways, right? Well, if it's moral for the U.S. citizen and owner of U.S. achievements and accomplishment, all this big bundle of infrastructure, markets, all of that, to choose who may or may not have access to and use such things, well, then if it's morally okay, then it should be morally fine to deny access. Tell someone at the gates, no. It's our property. We don't want you to use it right now. Maybe later, but not right now. So no, you can't have access to this country or any of its facilities, any of its medical care, any of it, anything, until the owner, namely us, the U.S. citizens and the government, say it's okay to do so. If you buy into that, well, then it would seem like it implies that U.S. citizens and the U.S. as a whole has some form of right to exclude people, immigrants. Well, then the next thing is this right to exclude three is that it's always moral for a nation or a people to protect and defend their own unique national identity, cultural traditions, institutions. For better or worse, the United States, you sometimes you have to travel away from the U.S. and look back and be exposed to other nations to really appreciate that there is a sort of national identity, a way of life here that is different in some distinctively different ways from other places. Like a person could travel and spend a few years, say, in China, in many places in China, and they would see that there is a difference culturally at times. Or could go to Africa or even Australia, England, anywhere in South America. You go to the Netherlands, you go to France, you can go to anywhere, Russia, any of these places. And what becomes clear pretty quickly is that people are people, typically no matter where you go, but there is some very robust differences at times from the way that family is conceptualized, from the way monies and finances conceptualized, from the way citizens' rights and responsibilities, entitlements are conceptualized. Not to mention religious differences and, well, to mention is religious differences and just day-to-day life, how employers treat employees differences. There's a lot of these differences out there. And so one could say that that means that every nation does have some semblance of a national identity, a cultural identity, that there's traditions, there's histories, there's institutions that exist in some nations that don't exist in others. And well, it's the way this argument works is it's always moral for a nation and its citizens to try to protect their identity, their way of life. We hear that phrase. Well, that's what this is referring to, is like the sort of United States way of existing, way of life, all that big bundle. And it includes those democratic principles and ideals. It includes all of that. But it also includes things like the way college admissions take place here versus somewhere like Taiwan. I mean, all of that goes into a nation's identity. And it's like wouldn't it seem morally okay for a nation to kind of protect that, especially if all of its citizens in a democracy style nation kind of say, yeah, it's pretty good being here. We kind of like the way things are. Well, wouldn't it seem okay for a nation to protect that? I mean, that's kind of the purpose of a military, isn't it? To defend and protect. That's our law enforcers, is to protect this sort of U.S. way of life. Well, if we couldn't do that, if we couldn't protect it, would we even be a nation anymore? If we had no defense or protections or ability to hang on to what we consider to be valuable as a member of the U.S., well, if it's moral to protect such things, and in order to protect such things, we sometimes have to limit the amount of cultural influence and change that comes into this country, and that we have to have some right to do so, like kind of staunch the flow of new things into this country or different things. If that's what's necessary in order to maintain this national cultural identity, and it's morally okay to do that, then wouldn't it seem that U.S. citizens are not morally obligated to just let anybody in whenever they may want to, even if they need to come in for health reasons? Doesn't it seem morally okay if the place that person's from is determined that their contribution may create some hindrance to the national identity or shake things up too much at a given time? Well, wouldn't it seem that we're not morally obligated to let them in? If there is a sort of right to protect that national identity. Interesting to think about. And then, consistent with democratic principles and ideals, this is like the contra to the pro-immigration version of this, is that some people could have argued that it's totally consistent that the current majority of U.S. citizens, and this is a claim, it would need to be checked and fact checked. This is just an argument that one could give. I'm not saying all these reasons are true. But it has been argued at times that the current majority of U.S. citizens consider it to be morally okay for the U.S. government to set limits and restrictions on immigration, even to the point of halting most all immigration if and when a genuine need to do so arises. For example, during a time of national crisis or national threat. Does that seem true? Everyone in this class, you're citizens, or you may be on a visa from another place, but you can think of it in terms of your own nation. At that point, does it seem true that a majority of citizens in the U.S. right now, or another nation, would buy into the idea that, yeah, it's okay for the government to severely restrict immigration if there's a genuine need to do so? Does anybody have any problem with the U.S. halting immigration if there's a huge possibility that people from a certain place may be terrorists? And I'm not talking about just a suspicion. I'm talking about there's a lot of data, a lot of, trustable, reliable data that say people from country X have every 9 out of 10, it's very likely that they may be, a threat to national security or something like that. Well, and the majority of the nation's citizens buy into that. Well, then in the U.S., given that it's a majority rule basis, the U.S. government couldn't do anything but comply and be morally and legally, that's its obligation to us as citizens. If the majority says no, or yeah, you can limit and restrict it, and that's what the majority wants, then a government by the people nation kind of has to do what the people want. It doesn't just kind of have to do it. It's morally, legally obligated to do it if it's a true form of democracy, whether representative or otherwise. That's the obligation of the government. That's what legitimates it to the citizens of such a form of government. If the government just makes up what it wants to do whenever it wants, without consulting the will of the people, then it's not a democracy anymore. Doesn't that seem kind of accurate? That's the way a person that offers this argument would want you to think, at least. And so the idea is it's consistent with democratic principles if it's true that the majority of U.S. citizens at this moment currently buy into the government's right to restrict immigration in times of national emergencies or whatever it deems. We elect them to make these decisions for us, and they decide that, yeah, there's a genuine threat, then wouldn't it be totally morally obligatory for them to look after our interest in that way? And if it is, then we can't be immoral when they turn people away. That's just the government doing what we want it to do, and it's not immoral for the government to follow the will of the people when it's a democracy. In fact, it's morally obligated to do exactly that. But this argument depends on, notice that if the current majority of U.S. citizens do not consider it to be morally okay for the government to do these things, well, then this argument doesn't apply anymore. It's based on what the current majority thought is and what the majority would willing to be to vote for. Well, citizen well-being should always be a nation's top priority. I mean, does that seem true that any nation, if you're a citizen, say a U.S. citizen, wouldn't you consider that to be the top priority of your government to look after, citizens? That isn't that the upside of being a member of a nation, is that your government looks after you and looks after you first. That it puts you at the top of the list as a citizen over and above a non-citizen. So if you went into a federal, like say a federally oversight medical institution, and you take your child, which is a U.S. citizen, in there, and there's only one dose of medicine left, and it's between your child and the child of a non-citizen, wouldn't you expect the federal system that's based on protecting you as a citizen and your child as a citizen, wouldn't you expect them to give that life-saving dose of medicine to your child before they did it to the non-citizen child or adult. Imagine if it's between your child and a non-citizen adult. Would you think that the government would have done something wrong if they say, well, yeah, your child or your spouse is going to die and you are a citizen, but this non-citizen needs it just as much, and so we're going to give it to them? Would you think your government had kind of let you down? That maybe they'd done something immoral, that they had violated your rights or entitlements based off of you being a citizen, that you were supposed to get top priority? Well, if you do think that way, and the reality is if you allow waves of non-citizens into the U.S., it's just bound that there's a limited amount of resources, that U.S. citizens are not always going to get top priority if you allow a continuous stream of new non-citizens in all the time, just given the nature of resources and limits, that sometimes non-citizens may very well get priority over citizens. If that's true, then wouldn't the U.S. be failing in its moral obligation to treat, well, you and yours as U.S. citizens as a top priority? Well, if all that's true, then it would seem that the U.S. and its citizens are not morally obligated to look out or help non-citizens. If it's going to hinder the U.S. as a whole and other U.S. citizens from treating, well, U.S. citizens as top priority, and that's the moral obligation, then that's going to override any obligation that may be out there for non-citizens. So an interesting argument to think about. National resources, I've already alluded to this, but the idea is that just being realistic about things, there's only so much time and medicine and oil and forest and water and things like that. There's only so much of that. Every highway only has a certain life expectancy until it has to be repaved. Every pond, every water supply, every aquifer takes time to refill. There's all resources, regardless whether it's U.S. or anywhere else. Those resources are limited. They're not infinite. And the idea is, by allowing in more immigrants, that'll always entail that those immigrants, these non-citizens, at the moment they come in, they're going to be consuming more of this already limited supply of resources. Now, you may not notice that for a long time, but it's kind of like that's the assumption of this argument, is that's just a reality. That's not being mean or anything. It's just like if you only have 10 gallons of water, and if you have 10 people in the U.S., well, each one would get a gallon of that water. But if you let in 10 immigrant people, well, the way our laws work is that we can't just, once people are here, we can't just ignore them. That the way our legal system currently is structured, we have to do something. We can't just let them die. So that means those 10 citizens are no longer all going to get a gallon. They may all get a half a gallon apiece, and then the other half gallon goes to the immigrants or the non-citizens. And so the idea is, does that seem morally okay? Well, if it seems actually the opposite, that it's more morally better to make sure that the citizens have all the resources first rather than the non-citizens, then it would seem that U.S. citizens in the U.S. is not morally obligated to help other places. If the resources are limited and it's more, well, it's just morally better to not have the most that can be had for citizens first, then it wouldn't seem there'd be any obligations to share. National community security. I won't read through this, but the idea is simply the government can never be certain about some things. That any potential person that shows up at the gate of the U.S., they could be a threat. I mean, even if they have all the paperwork right, they could be. I mean, the reality is any U.S. citizen could be too, but any immigrant could be as well. And it's even more shaky with someone coming from a different place because, We don't know about all their paperwork, all their systems, their computer databases, their tracking. We can't ever be 100% certain about any of that stuff. I mean, sometimes you can be really sure that, yeah, this might be bad if the bad person didn't cover their trail. But there's always a sort of wild card that it could be a potential security threat. Well, that combined with the government's core responsibility to protect its safety and well-being of U.S. citizens, that would seem if the government decides that the best way to protect us is to not let as many people in, then it would seem that the U.S. and its citizens wouldn't be morally obligated to help people. That moral obligation would force us to help regardless of the threat. But that's kind of the way moral obligations tend to go, is they're really weighty. They override a lot of things. But if it's true that the government can't be certain and that it's got a more important moral responsibility, namely to protect us at all costs, and doing so means limiting immigration, well, then we couldn't be morally obligated to have to help everybody that shows up at the door. The same way with health, national health, like it's never certain that when someone from another place shows up, we couldn't know whether they have maybe Ebola. I don't know. That happened a few years back where there were some people that had Ebola, and they did get on planes and they did fly some places. But the idea is that it was captured, quarantined, but maybe it could be missed the next time around. And so if the government thought it was best to limit immigration or maybe just stop it altogether to protect an Ebola outbreak in the U.S., which is really deadly, or some other thing even worse or equally as bad, then doesn't it seem like if the government's morally obligated to protect us in that kind of way, then there's no way that it could at the same time be morally obligated to help whoever shows up at the gate, or nor could we. That's the way that argument works. And then this one's a kind of neat one that you see show up at times, is even open borders advocates don't want U.S. borders to be completely open. And now you can turn this the other way. Typically, even closed borders advocates don't want the borders to be completely closed most times. We'll talk about that when we get a little further in this handout. But yeah, the idea is that most people that will argue, this is the claim at least. I'm not saying this is fact. It's just a claim that's made, is that a lot of people that seem to want to argue for, opening up the borders more, reducing the restrictions, making the process quicker, to make it less inconvenient. Many of those people will at the same time, if you ask them, well, what if that person had Ebola? They might immediately say, oh, well, now we may stop them at the gate. They may not, get in. It seems like even the open borders, or say that there was another large-scale terrorist attack here, or an attack, that kills a lot of people here. It's likely that many open borders advocates will back off of that. They'll be like, well, it may be best to not let certain immigrants in. So it's like, it's rare, like what it would happen, that's this sort of qualification down here at the tail of this first reason, is that a person who wants to maintain that the borders should be kept wide open, even if there are legitimate threats detected, that person would be what some would say is dangerously insane as far as protecting the U.S. and its citizens go, is that someone who just wants everything wide open regardless of detected threats or high probability threats or whatever you want to say, that person's lost their mind, is what some people would say. That being a reasonable U.S. citizen means you do have to at some point say that, yeah, maybe not everybody should always get in. Well, if that's true, and that open borders advocates can't consistently claim that U.S. citizens should always have moral responsibility to let everyone in, well then, U.S. citizens in the U.S. can't be absolutely morally obligated to do it. That at least undermines the not absolutely notion of that. That we're not absolutely morally obligated to just let everybody in. Maybe we're obligated to let some in, but it's still not immoral to stop some from coming in. And then there's also a sort of interesting thing where sometimes when the context of this argument is that sometimes an open borders advocate will be real quick. Like, here's the sort of question that can be asked sometimes of a person that's immigration is great, open the doors, let everybody in. Well, then you can ask that person that, well, what if, like, the people coming in, it was known that that country happened to be extremely racist or sexist or ageist or xenophobic or whatever. That what if we kind of knew, just given the culture and given the knowledge, I mean, sometimes we can know certain things that these immigrants say they're card carrying members of some well documented racial group, race hate group, for example. Well, or that they just don't share, like, that they just don't share ideas of respect for others or moral equality. That this group of immigrants, they just don't share any of those values. That in fact they're big fans of starting tyrannies where only them control everything. And so say that you could confirm some of that stuff. Well, most open borders advocates or pro-immigration advocates are going to say, well, those people, they're so far, they'd be too big of a problem. We don't let them in. So the idea is that the open borders advocate can't have their cake and eat it too. That if they're willing to say that it's fine to exclude some people and no moral violation has occurred for doing it, even if they're sick and they're needy, but they're part of this well-documented hate group, that, people like that get sick too. They need to. They can be poor too. They could show up at the gate too. And so if the open borders advocate's not willing to keep waving them through, they want to put the stop sign up sometimes. Well, then that means there's not an absolute moral obligation. It's something, but it's not absolute. There may be an obligation, but it's not an absolute. That's the way that argument works. And then I think this is one of the last ones. Yeah, this is the last argument. It's kind of an interesting one. Is just the right to just say no without apology nor explanation. That the way this argument works is that reasonable U.S. citizens, and notice it says reasonable, recognize that each and every citizen in the U.S. or a U.S. institution has an absolute moral right sometimes to just say no without apology nor explanation. There may sometimes be legal consequences for doing so. There surely are at times. But the moral right is still there. It may be illegal to say no, to let someone do something with your property at a given time. Like an example would be, say that firefighters need to cross your yard. Your yard's the only way they can access a house that's burning down right behind your house. And so the firefighters try to cross your property and you start shooting at them and say, no, you can't cross my property. You're trespassing. Well, or you don't even tell them they're trespassing. You just say, no, you can't cross it. Well, then you could be arrested for that by blocking first responders. But doesn't the person still have a moral right to say no? Even if it's the wrong thing to do morally, don't they still have a right to say no? It doesn't mean that they may not be overridden. It doesn't mean they may not get arrested for it. But don't people in the U.S., many people buy into this notion is you can just say no. Sometimes you don't have to explain it. You don't have to apologize. You can just say no. It doesn't matter if the other person or group on the other side of it has the right of it. Don't people in the U.S. doesn't the U.S. have a sort of heavy-duty individualism, that robust sense of the individual? Isn't there enough of that in this culture to at times just recognize that, yeah, we do kind of buy into this idea that people can just say no and they don't have to apologize to us for it. They don't have to explain their reasoning. Now, if they're illegal, they'll be punished legally, but morally, they can still do that. If you buy into that, examples that might help you kind of more buy into it is example of a person. Say that someone's on the street and here's someone that wants to rape them. Don't we think that that person has the right to just say no? To say no. And then do we think that that rapist is entitled to an apology or explanation? Typically not. If that rapist is trying to rape you and you say no, typically the response is not to say, well, you didn't give them your reasons for no, so it was okay for them to rape you. Or you should have apologized for inconveniencing them, so that's where you went wrong. Typically, that's not the response. Typically, it seems to be, at least, according to the person, someone who'd make an argument like this, that saying no to the rapist does not require apology nor explanation. It is the person's moral right to just say no in that situation. There's also evidence that such a belief floats in this culture is that most of our employers at this point, it's definitely this way in many businesses in South Carolina, this notion of at-will employment states, and it's many states in the U.S. at this point, where you sign a contract, and especially if you work for a state institution, where both the employer and the employee, they can just say no. They just stop showing up to work. They do not have to apologize. They do not have to provide an explanation. The employee can just stop showing up. And that employer has no legal recourse. It goes the same way with the employer. The employer can terminate the contract at any point in time. They don't have to give an explanation. They don't have to give a reason. There's no legal consequences for them doing that. Now, this isn't true in all fields. For example, in medicine, like say a nurse could be charged with patient neglect if they just walk up and leave in the middle of a shift and don't tell anybody and patients don't get their medication. Yeah, police, first responders, nurses, doctors, they can't, they don't necessarily get this right to just say no. Well, they can still have the moral right to say no and leave, but there's legal consequences for doing so. But in your typical, though, job, there supposedly is none. That, if you work for some state institution like, say, the driver's license office, and you decide just not to show up to work, well, your boss can call you, and then when they call you and say, yeah, are you coming to work again? You say no. Well, then legally there may be no recourse. That's what the notion of at-will employment is. The employer can just call you and say no, or in the middle of your shift say no, we don't want you here anymore. And you can ask them why, but they're under no obligation to apologize to you nor explain that. That's part of U.S. employment law in a lot of states. And also, one supposedly can just say no to drugs, to a marriage proposal. If you don't want to marry somebody, it would sure be nice if you might explain your reasons or apologize to them, especially if they put a lot of time and effort into the relationship. But are you morally obligated to do that? Or is your moral right just to say no for whatever reasons you have? And then a possible purchase. If you go to a car lot, the salesperson would really like you to buy the car, you can always say no. You're not obligated just because you took up 10 days of that salesperson time. Say you went back day after day after day and kind of that person really thought you wanted to buy, and you just say you thought you did too, but then at the end you decide, no, this isn't the best financial purchase for me at the moment. Do you ever have to go back and explain your reasons to the salesperson? Are you morally obligated to? Some people say no. No, you're not. Also, we have this, those sort of, you can plead the fifth, or like when someone is arrested, you have the right to remain silent. Well, what is that if not your ability to just say no if any questions are asked to you? Your silence is that no. It's like, no. You don't apologize for not saying anything. You don't explain why you're not saying anything. You just exercise your ability not to say anything. That's your no, isn't it? And so the idea is, if we do have in the U.S. a moral right to always just say no, there may be legal consequences, but morally we're in the clear for saying no. And we can do that without apology or explanation. And if it resides at the very core of U.S. citizens' self-determination, individuality, autonomy, and culture, well, then it would seem to follow that it's never immoral for a U.S. citizen or the larger U.S. to just say no. When somebody shows up at the border and wants to come in, if we say no, they're not entitled to an apology nor an explanation, and we've done nothing immoral. Saying no is not immoral. It's interesting. I mean, I don't know if people buy into that argument or not, but it's a neat argument to consider. And it's one that you see floating around out there at times. Now, at this point, we've surveyed quite a few arguments. I've talked through them. You'll look through them, read them carefully. And but the thing we need to do always after you're exposed to a bunch of arguments is that all these arguments, notice at the top of them, I haven't emphasized this, but at the top of every one of them, I've kind of identified some of the values, moral and ethical values, disvalues, or just values, disvalues in general that happen to be implied by these arguments. And you would want to go back, look at those arguments and the values and the disvalues and kind of compare them, the pro-con, against each other, and really try to see what's at stake. What does each of those reasons imply? Do any of those arguments need more helper reasons? Is there implicit reasons that I haven't listed out here? All of that's necessary to truly kind of understand what someone might be doing when they offer arguments like those. And so that means that the arguments in the wild, the real world about immigration for and against, well, first off, they tend to be way more complicated than what we've looked at. But sometimes not. Sometimes they are as straightforward as what we've seen, but they're definitely much more wishy-washy. That if you go into like the kind of professional grade stuff, a lot of what you're going to encounter is more defenses of the maybes. It's not going to be as clean as the U.S. and its citizens are not, or the U.S. and its citizens are. That in the wild, in just debates, political, legal, moral, you're typically, even the ethicists are going to be that we as citizens or the U.S. as a nation, it's not always morally obligated to allow immigration in these circumstances, but it may very well be morally obligated in these other circumstances. And so what that means is in the wild, you're going to see a whole lot of defenses of maybe. That depends on circumstances. That's going to be your norm, but to be able to understand that norm, it gets embedded in all these pro-con scenarios. So I wanted everybody to have exposure to these arguments here. These are about as clean as it ever gets. It only gets murkier the deeper you go into these, sort of, to use this water metaphor, the deeper you go into the water of immigration, ethical, moral debates, or legal, political debates, the waters just get murkier because you'll get partial defenses of no obligation and partial defenses of heavy-duty obligations, and you get those that coming out of the mouth of a single person. There's kind of yes for certain immigrants, no for other immigrants. That's the norm of what you'll encounter. So, but now you have a sort of the cleanest pro-con that I could generate for you. That's the best I could do at this moment. And so that gives everybody a basis to kind of build off of and go further with. But the thing to know is, in order to understand that it's a lot of wish-wash, meaning that it's going to be some in favor of letting some people in, not in favor of letting other people in. And we have moral obligations to let some in. Like, for example, we may, like, a sort of restricted closed borders person might be like, well, if it's from a friendly nation, the immigrants are, and they are sick, they're needy, and we have a history with these people, they've done a lot for us, then sure, we should let them in. But we just say no to everybody else. You see, it's like that out in the wild with these arguments. So most open borders advocates acknowledge that some immigration restrictions and exclusions are practically helpful and necessary, and most closed restricted borders advocates acknowledge that some immigration allowances are practically helpful and sometimes necessary. So both sides of this are really more toward the middle road where everybody actually is. Now, there are some who are hardcore, close everything down, and then there are hardcore of open everything up. But typically, people are going to be somewhere in the middle. That's just what you need to kind of understand, and you'll need to go back and look at these arguments and look for implied premises. Try to think through how the values and disvalues, what work they're doing in each of these arguments. I've just got you started with trying to identify some of them that are in play in each of these arguments, but it's a good exercise to go through and see the more that you can find. So now, analysis, your decision. Well, that's everyone's thoughts, and that's what we're going to be doing in this week's discussion. In this week's discussion, we'll have opportunity to talk a whole lot more about this stuff, and I definitely look forward to this week's discussion. But more than anything else, I hope this video has been helpful, and definitely email me. Let me know if there's questions about any of this stuff. If not for this week, for any of these weeks, I'm always here to help, and I'll always do my best to help. Well, until this week's discussion.